What's the main thing that drives evolution? Natural selection, right? Natural selection, but there's also other factors, right? Like changes in allele frequencies. There's also genetic drift. Could be something. What's two examples of genetic drift? Alex, what's one? It's an effect, yeah. Bottleneck, least founder effect, right? Okay, so we say allele frequencies and genetic drift, like the founder effect, the bottleneck effect, and also obviously natural selection drives that. This is a bit of a review. Speciation, what do we say speciation was? The formation of new species. Okay, and just a little bit of clarification, right? So we said that we have not observed from beginning to end in science one species becoming another species, correct? Yes, and that is true, okay? Speciation does take a good amount of time, whereas like modern science, we have not seen from beginning to end. Now, both evolutionists and creationists will agree now, depends, but for the most part will agree that speciation is something that does take place, okay? And I'll give you guys a pretty good explanation about that in a bit. But basically, up until now, we've seen organisms finish speciation, and we know where they began, basically. So we've seen the products of speciation, and we've also seen organisms beginning speciation, right? So changing their allele frequency so much, right? Changing the allele so much that it's actually considered a different species, okay? Seen this in the finches, in the Galapagos, and a number of other organisms. We're not going to go into all of them today, but speciation is something that is seen in nature. Now, where is the problem with this? The problem is that speciation will only happen where one species basically splits and becomes different species, right? So what we're saying is that we don't have a basic lineage of a single-celled organism becoming multicellular, becoming a simple organism, becoming a more complex until you get to humans, right? We're not saying that a lizard eventually became a human. We're saying that a type of lizard undergoes some sort of boundary change or some sort of something that causes it to change and diverge into different species, okay? Yes?
Okay, so there are just some things that like are kind of questionable. So evolutionists think that sheep, which are like idiots, are like more fit than a 1,000-pound dinosaur who can chop up sheep in like 5 seconds. You know what I'm saying?
Okay. I wouldn't say that, because everything does have its role, even as far as like evolution is concerned in nature. Now, a dinosaur is a predatory animal, right? But a sheep, as long as it can avoid predators, doesn't need to like be this like big creature that can like kill things, right? Because it just eats grass, right? And as long as it's somewhere where it can thrive without being eaten, then it can still be fit, right? Remember that fitness isn't like being big, right? Fitness is how well you can find a mate and give your genes to the next generation. So if you have a sheep that baas really loudly and that attracts females, and it can give, but it's like scrawny, whatever, but it can still attract females to give its offspring, to make more offspring, then the sheep is still like, yeah, maybe, definitely its brain is more developed, right? Because mammal brains are more developed than like whatever we consider dinosaurs, reptiles, even though there's like more evidence or more like birds sometimes. But it is more like advanced as far as like its brain, but it does have its role in nature. So just because it can't beat a dinosaur doesn't mean it's not fit. Does that kind of like make sense? Yeah? Cool, good question. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, right? Like, how come that like we're probably the most fit animals because we've found a way to like kill huge things with like a little thing that we hold in our hands, right? That's like creativity, using our brains to solve problems, right? But like, does that mean that every other organism, since it's not as powerful as us, need to be eliminated? The answer to that is probably no, because they all have their role in nature as well. Yeah, good points. Okay, so speciation. There are two types of speciation that we do need to know. It's not in your books, but we are, what are we?
Professional
Yeah,
biology
good.
students.
So, one type of speciation is allopatric speciation. And you will need to know this for tomorrow, allopatric speciation. The other type is sympatric speciation, okay? Sympatric. Allopatric is a speciation that happens basically when speciation happens because of a geographical boundary between two organisms, right? So let's say that you have birds on an island. For some reason, there's like an earthquake, and it causes a huge split in the island. Tectonic plates move the island, and it creates two different islands now. Those different species are only able to interbreed with each other, right? And then they become so different that that geographic barrier, right, the fact that they're on two different islands, now cause them to undergo speciation. But that's due to the geographic barrier. Okay, that's allopatric. And sympatric speciation is going to happen when they are still in the same area, but they just diverge for whatever reason, whether it's because just selection, right? Like reproductive selection, they decide, all the females decide they don't like gorillas with a white patch on their chest, right? So those are no longer around, and then natural selection takes place, and it changes that. Okay, so you need to know these two. This is because of a geographic barrier. This one is without a geographic barrier. Okay, allopatric and sympatric speciation. Okay, sometimes a geographic barrier that basically the definition that a geographic barrier causes two organisms not to mate, that's called a reproductive barrier, right? So like, I could really be attracted to a lady in Macedonia, but she's really far away. So all the oceans and land between me and her would be that reproductive barrier, right? And let's say she doesn't have a phone either. That's another reproductive barrier, because how am I going to find her, right? Okay, I bet I could if I really tried, but who wants to go through all that work for a girl, right? Okay, so that's a reproductive barrier.
Wow, you're really representing the boys.
No simps allowed.
He said, who wants to go through all that trouble?
So,
Sir, I think you would like to read the notes, sir.
thankfully, God put SV in Westwood Christian School where I was, so there was no, I don't want to say this.
How to get your girl?
How to Catch a Woman, sir. By
Okay.
Nicholas R.
Okay.
One of my English publishers.
Alright, so let's talk a little bit about what a phylogenetic tree. Does anyone know what a phylogenetic tree is? Jacob, what's a phylogenetic tree?
Another graph of basically it states how organisms are related to each other from common ancestors.
Perfect. Yeah, that's exactly it. Okay. So basically, you have this kind of like flowchart type deal, right? Where you have something like this, okay, and then they basically tell you all the common ancestors between organisms, right? So if these are all mammals, then this is the mammal common ancestor.
Let's go.
Okay. All right. Any questions? Okay. They indicate common ancestors, basically. All right. You don't need to know too much about that. You just need to know what it is. Any questions so far? We're going on to the last slide. All right, let's talk a little bit more about speciation. Last thing I want to say, okay, we said that there are several examples of organisms in the process of speciation or having finished speciation, right? Haven't been able to see one completely speciate. But if you think about it, let's think about the flood. Let's think about Noah's Ark, okay? So in Noah's Ark, today on the earth, there are 8.1 million species of organisms. Okay, 8.1 million species of organisms. That's every organism, every living thing that's alive. 8.1 million. Okay, not just animals. Think about would it be possible to fit 8.1 million species on the ark? No, definitely not.
Is it like including bugs?
Including bugs, yes, including bugs. But even then, like, that's way too many species, okay? 8.1 million species. Just like think about, yes, some species are much bigger than others. Some species, yes, are bacteria. But yeah, if we're talking about animals, right, still, there are way too many species of animals to fit on the ark, right? So at that point, God was able to give instructions so that for there to be one male and one female of every animal, right? After their own kind of like in creation, correct? So we don't see an instruction of like every single species. Remember we said that kinds we don't know exactly what kinds means, right, by our definition. But we said that kinds kind of refer to what? Like classification. Not phylums, close families. Okay, so families, yes, they're closest to families. So basically, listen, the animals and the organisms that were present on the ark had to be very genetically diverse, if that makes sense, right? So we couldn't just have a poodle, right? It had to be an organism that had a very high diversity in their genes, so that when they start mating, then you can have these different allele frequencies that cause different speciation later on, okay? Does that kind of make sense to everyone? So speciation can happen, okay? What we see nowadays mostly is differences in subspecies, okay? In subspecies, and that's why we say in dog breeds you have different subspecies, and those are going to be able to interbreed, and that's fine, right? But species, what's the definition of species? How can we tell one species from another? Lucia? If their offspring can reproduce, right? Not if they can reproduce, but if their offspring can also have children or offspring. So that means if they can be grandparents, basically. Okay. Any questions over that? Last slide. Okay, so let's talk a little bit, very briefly, about the history of man. Right? We know that man created